Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. In this episode, we speak to Pulitzer Prize winning composer and musician Henry Threadgill and the co-author of his autobiography, Brent Hayes Edwards. The book we discuss, which was published last year, is entitled Easily Slip into Another World, A Life in Music. Henry Threadgill was born in Chicago in 1944. He is one of the most significant and innovative composers of the 20th and 21st centuries. In addition to being an award-winning composer and an amazing saxophonist and flautist, he is also known for his percussion work, in particular the invention of the hubkaphone, a marimba-like instrument made out of hubcaps. He has been a leader or co-leader of the bands Air, Ensemble Double Up, Make a Move, the Henry Threadgill Ensemble, the Henry Threadgill Sextett, the Situation Society Dance Band, Very Circus, X75, Zooid, and 14 or 15 Kestra, AG, and probably some others I wasn't able to track down. If we went into all the bands and groups Henry was a part of, that list would be 3 times as long. In recent years, Threadgill has established a completely new chromatic system for musical composition outside the confines of diatonic harmony. In 2016, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for In for a Penny, In for a Pound, an album he composed for his sextet Zooid. He currently lives in New York. Brent Hayes Edwards is a professor at the Center for Jazz Studies at Columbia University and director of the Scholars in Residence program at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture at the New York Public Library. Edwards is also the author of Epistrophes, Jazz, and the Literary Imagination, and the Practice of Diaspora, Literature, Translation, and the Rise of Black Internationalism. So why this episode? It's a bit outside of most of our content here. Perhaps the closest things we've done to a conversation like this would be the dialogue hosted between Fred Moten and Hanif Abdurraqib, or the interview we did with Dion Brand in 2022. But although I didn't ask it directly, the guiding question that animated this interview and engagement with Henry and Brent's book for me is, what insights might a truly revolutionary composer have for aspiring revolutionary organizers or for cultural workers seeking to maximize the revolutionary possibilities of their work? We hope you enjoy this conversation and that it proves as meaningful to you as it was to us. It was a tremendous honor to sit down with Henry Threadgill and Brent Hayes Edwards to discuss their beautiful book, Easily Slip into Another World, A Life in Music, which is available now everywhere. Thank you to Aidan Elias for co-producing this episode. If you appreciate the work we do, as always, you can support that work for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/millennialsarekillingcapitalism. All right, so we have here Brent Hayes Edwards and Henry Threadgill to talk about the book, Easily Slip into Another World, A Life in Music. Thank you both for this conversation. Obviously, this book is a collaboration between the two of you. I'm, interested in what drew you to, working on this together and kind of the process of putting it together. I really enjoyed how the book was composed, and I'm sure there was quite an intentional process around that composition. So I wondered if you could just say a little bit up front about those things, about how you, got to work together on this book and that process of composing that book, what it was like for both of you.
You want to start, Henry? Well, we met. I had seen Henry perform and knew his music, but we met in person. I went up and introduced myself to him more than 15 years ago, about 2006, after a workshop he was doing at the Jazz Gallery downtown. And I was at that time, research for a book project on the downtown jazz scene in New York in the 1970s. So I asked him if I could interview him, which we did. And that led to an exchange and a relationship. I had dug up a lot of archival recordings and materials about the years when he and the trio Air came to New York from Chicago in the mid-70s. And so I gave him some of the unreleased archival recordings I had and some of the journalistic coverage of the early years of AIR. And we had that first interview about his experience of New York in that moment. And a few years later, it developed organically over the next decade and a half. A few years later, Henry asked me to help him do not just an interview, but a full-fledged oral history. And how was I to say no? It's one of my heroes. I said, of course, and then had to figure out how to proceed. But we went into a deep dive through Henry's life and career. I did a huge amount of research in preparation for it, trying to read everything that had been written about Henry, every profile, every interview, every record review, as well as knowing his music. And then we really just moved through his life. We, as oral histories do, we jumped around and touched on a number of themes and then would come back and go deeper into particular themes. But we did that over a few years, multiple sessions, many hours, and then I would transcribe those sessions. So I had, at the end of that process, many hundreds of single-space pages of oral history transcript. And then it shifted again. And one thing that's funny that Henry and I laugh about at this point, after the long saga, is neither of us can quite remember how it shifted from an oral history project to a book project. At a certain point, it became, we both realized or both gravitated toward a realization that it needed to be a book, that it wasn't just a transcript, but we wanted to make it a literary product. And that became a completely different ballgame, because an oral history transcript, if I showed you the transcripts, first of all, it's dialogic. It's the two of us in conversation. It's a back and forth. So there's that call and response element to it. But it's much more informal, and an oral history jumps around because someone's memory doesn't work in chronological order. A thing will trigger a particular story or a particular anecdote. And so oral histories tend to move around a lot. Making it into a literary autobiography then was an entirely different undertaking. And so we continued having our conversations and our oral sessions for hours and hours periodically. But then I started trying to figure out how to put it into written form. And Henry assigned me, he said, "You're the writer," if I can quote you, Henry, figure out how to put it together. And so I gave a lot of thought to the form of the book. And I guess the thing that I can say about it quickly is that, to me, Henry is very simply, one of the great composers of the late 20th century. And I think of him as an extraordinary formal innovator. I wanted to find a way to play with and expand the possibilities of the form of literary autobiography, not to mirror or to mimic what he does in his music, but to do something that would be adequate to play with the form of writing and the form of the book a little bit, in a way that would echo or learn something from the brilliance of what he does in sound. So what I came up with was what I think of as the modular structure of the book, where it's not just chronological, but there are anecdotes that weave in and out of each other, and it moves around. It is mostly chronological, but it does jump around. And there are things, even from the beginning of his life, the stories about his grandfather in Chicago, that come at the very end of the book. So it does move around in time and chronology. And I thought that modular structure in some ways reflected the experimentation that I heard in the modular structure of some of his music. That's the short version of the story. Is that, Henry, do you have something to add?
I don't think so. You pretty much covered it.
Right on. It was funny as you were starting to talk about that. Modular or module was the word that started to come out even before you said it. And, because that is such an interesting aspect, obviously, of your, work as an innovator musically, Henry, but also, it comes through in the narration of the story of, how you get interested in these modular approaches. I can't remember the musician that you're working with, but there was a while where you're working with someone else's band, right? And you talk about kind of how it was a little bit like disoriented the way that they work
Cecil
together.
Taylor.
Cecil Taylor, right? And but then you figured out these are modular structures. Do you have anything to add on that piece?
No, the the idea that something can be used all over the place, and that it can be turned inside out, inverted, spin around upside down. You know, it's not a new idea, um, but it's how you use it. It can become a new idea in how you use it in whatever discipline you're involved in. It could be film, dance, or music composition. So you can be quite innovative with it, even though the idea is an old idea. It's an old African idea, actually,
Yeah.
from the Benin Empire, I would say.
Yeah. One of the themes that also comes through in this book is kind of the internationalism, I guess I would say, of your musical influences, of all of these connections that you make along the way in your life, obviously due to you being sent to Vietnam, not of your own, choosing, of course, obviously of, there's the time in Venezuela and then Trinidad and various musicians you meet along the way that are trained in different places. And, I remember you at one point you're talking about a musician who had gone to school in Cuba and how, basically they just trained all the time. But there was like a discussion about how different it would be to have a basis in rhythm in learning the drums versus in the United States where like learning classical piano is kind of like one of the starting points for music. So I really I don't know that I got a lot of that. I mean, even with the invention of the hubkaphone, I mean, that's a great story in itself. And perhaps we could say a little bit about that story, but also that you also reflected the relationship of gongs in the Vietnamese context and the influence of that. So yeah, I don't know if either of you have reflections on kind of the internationalism in this story.
So it's because of the music comes from everywhere, unless you live in a small world. Like that song, it's a small world after all. It's not a good world, a small world, you know. When you listen to all kinds of music, you're getting instructed in the international language of music because there's really no such thing as that art or music is universal. That's really not true. What is true about it that everybody might have it, but everybody don't understand it necessarily. One culture might not understand what another culture is doing. That's quite a different concept in itself. But like I said, listening to music from the community that I grew up in, which was a international community in terms of on the ground, the people that were living in Chicago, and then what was being broadcast over the airways. Between those two things, that was an international world of music right there. It completely jumped outside of the Black culture that I was growing up in. It completely left that, you know. And that's where it's always been. Once you start on this road, you're only concerned with the musical development and musical language. I'm not concerned about where it comes from, what people do with it. Is it something that I can use? Will it help me to build a house that won't go down when an earthquake hits? So I use it. You use everything. That's where I say you should. Artists should be concerned with all languages.
Yeah, appreciate that.
I would just add one thing. It certainly is rooted in Henry's upbringing and the international influence of radio and early TV in that moment in Chicago. But I also think of this element of Henry's life and music as a protocol that emerges from the AACM, for the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, the Musicians Collective in Chicago that was founded in 1965 that Henry is an important member of. The two tenets to me of the AECM, the two core ones, are first about composition. It's not, the world of music is not divided into a few people who compose and the rest of people who play compositions, who realize other compositions, the compositions of those privileged few. Everybody needs to be a composer. So you bring your stuff and you figure out how to inhabit that status of being a composer. And once you start thinking of yourself not just as a musician, but as a composer, as someone with an artistic vision and someone committed to a methodology and a language as a musician, writing his or her own music, then the world opens up to you. If you've been listening to radio the way Henry was in the early years of his life. Hindemith is in that category just as much as Mario Bauza is, just as much as Cecil Taylor is. The world of those who fit in that category suddenly expands. And the other thing that I think of as an AACM protocol that maybe, Henry, you can say a little bit more about, I think they made it explicit. My understanding from you is that Muhal said this, that Steve Coran said this, go out and discover the world. You might think of the ACM as just a local scene, just some radical artists hanging out in Chicago, but there's a worldliness to the ACM. There's a reason that Lester Bowie went to Nigeria and that Douglas Ewart went to Africa to study flutes. That worldliness is built into the AACM mindset. Am I right, Henry?
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah. That was part of our growth concept, to go and find out something and bring it back and to see how we can all learn something from it, And so the musicians would go out off to different parts of the world and study different things, It remained that way for a long time,
Yeah, thank you both for that. So I want to go to something you mentioned a little bit earlier, Brent, which was, Henry's experiences growing up and then these elders, his great grandfather, Peyton Robinson, who, there's a quote in the book, almost sounded like the stories about him almost sounded like myths, but they were true. And over the years, we've talked to a number of folks who are, veterans of SNCC or veterans of the Black Panther Party. And for like all of the folks that grew up kind of in your age range, Henry, the story of Emmett Till and his lynching is like foundational to their kind of, they all remember it and they all have stories of where they were and how they related to it and what they're, but obviously for you, your story is personal on a lot of levels. You went to the same barbershop as him growing up in Chicago. And obviously the book also details, you being attacked by a white mob, growing up or being, threatened by them. Well, actually attacked, I mean, almost killed, right? And so these are memories, that are recounted in kind of the formative years as you're a young person, as you're also in the same period that you're really growing your interest in music. So I just wanted to give space because it's such an important part of the book for you to talk about these things a little bit, however you would like to. I mean, the stories of Peyton Robinson are amazing, and I would love if we could share a little bit of that. But I also just, the relationship of violence also and of segregation on your youth, I think is also seems like a very important aspect of your story as well.
Well, the thing about the puzzle to me about Peyton Robinson was that I had never known anyone that was that fearless in my life. There was no place to look in the community and see another prototype like that. Black people did not behave the way my great-grandfather behaved. They did not openly carry guns and did not welcome a fight from anybody. I was always confused. I said, what shaped this man, And things can shape you, but how do you go up in no fear? He had a twin brother that got killed in Chicago. That story's in the book. Mm-hmm. And he came by my grandmother's house, and my aunts and uncles were there, and everybody was sad about their great uncle being killed in the streets. And I remember sitting there looking at him, and he wasn't sad at all. He was just angry. And Somebody said something to him about feeling bad. He said, "I don't feel bad. I just wish I'd have been there. If I'd have been there, they'd have really seen something." In other words, I don't care nothing about dying. If I'd have been there, they'd have saw a fight that they would have remembered forever.
Mhm.
I don't know how you become a person like that, you know. I mean, especially when you put it in perspective with like the foot, I mean, you know, white America's foot on the back of black people, you know, how did it get, I mean, you know, we have like Frederick Douglass and Marcus Garvey, and, you know, different people, you know, but these people this is rhetoric. This is nobody talking about getting up ready to fight. See, that's a whole different person, you know. He's not ready to talk to you about political theories and stuff, you know? But he had made an assessment of America and decided that he wasn't paying for anything in this country. That's what got me also, that he would never pay for anything. He would not pay on public transportation. He would go in stores and take what he wanted, you know, because they owed him, which they did.
Yeah, they sure did. Yeah, I mean, Brent, I want you to add, but I mean, just also the fact that Peyton is born in like early Reconstruction, right, or right after the Civil War. So yeah, but go ahead, Brent, share what you want to offer on it.
No, to me, I mean, I remember the session. I remember where we were that particular day when Henry told me about Emmett Till and knowing Emmett Till in the barbershop in Chicago. And I remember being blown away by thinking, just realizing, oh, they're about the same age. And oh, of course they could have crossed paths. It had never occurred to me. But to me, the question behind that, and it's also the question in the stories Henry tells about his great grandfather and also his grandfather, they're deeper and more complex questions about where sensibility is shaped, especially for an artist, but also in a political sense too. Where does it come from? Where does resilience come from? Where does determination come from? Where does obstinacy come from? Where does curiosity come from? That urge to go a little further, look a little deeper, or not be satisfied with this, press a little further than where you are. These things work in subtle ways. They're not simply passed down as an inheritance from a father to a son or a grandfather or great grandfather or a great grandmother. But these influences, the way they shape you, I feel like that's a lot of what's behind those questions. So both with Emmett Till and with the Vietnam chapters, the question to me at the bottom of that is, what does it do to you as an artist, as a future composer, to have that? Something that, as Henry says in the book, his parents didn't sit down and have a conversation about Emmett Till's death. They didn't have a conversation and look at the photos with their kids, the photos in jet of Emmett Till's mutilated body. What does it do to you as an artist to be exposed to violence, to be exposed to segregation, to be exposed to this kind of existential threat? And how does it shape those qualities of sensibility that are hard to define and hard to trace, like determination or resignation? Because it can, as Henry says, not everybody is like Peyton Robinson. It also can shape you in another way where you're inclined not to cause a struggle, not to start a fight, but to slow things down or to calm things up. So to me, those are the deep questions behind those really incredible anecdotes that he tells, both about his family, but also about the climate of segregation and violence in Chicago in the early chapters.
Yeah, thank you. So there's like these great little pieces of life philosophy throughout the text. And a few that stood out to me were, the idea that there was a thought to call this book Failure is Everything. And there's a discussion of failure as the greatest motivator of all. I think it's the name of the first chapter, but Henry, your father used to say too much sugar to refer to basically somebody who I guess got lucky in a kind of undeserving way or something, but there was an implication that you need some deprivation in your life. A little later in that same chapter, there's a quote, practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent. And so I wondered if you could say a little bit more about, for you, the importance of failure and how you think about practice in relation to learning music.
Well, the thing about failure, to understand failure that I'm talking about and failure today now is shameful. It wasn't shameful before. It wasn't considered a great position to be in, but like people would do anything now. They would do immoral, unethical things in order not to be in that position of where you didn't accomplish something, where you fail. All of a sudden you're some kind of freak today. The failure. Everybody points to the failure. Because these ideas change in time. What is good, what is bad, and all these different things, right? Well, but it was personal. It was extremely personal and painful, especially when you're a kid, a young person. Once you get to those teenage years, how things, before the teenage years, you don't experience the same kind of personal pain of, like somebody say, your hair is too short. Your feet is too big. Your clothes don't look good. You know what I'm saying? You go home and look in the mirror and feel bad about it. So I had something to prove. I had to prove, well, first of all, I had to prove to myself, was I doing the right thing? Should I be in music at all? That was a serious issue because music has saved my life. See, I had struck off on a course of music to straighten out my life as a kid for a lot of wrong things I was doing, right? So now it was a question of like, did I make a mistake? So I really had to go to work. I mean, I really went to work. I mean, I can't even tell you how hard I worked. And I think that's the greatest thing, that kind of personal motivation to get up and say, look, I'm changing my life right now. People are not going to see me as the guy that they saw 2 days ago. When I come back, you're going to see me as somebody else, That is the greatest thing. And it's just like, the shame of like the street cleaner coming in, and the people come out the street and say the street is dirty. Well, the street cleaner don't even feel bad anymore. But the street cleaner used to feel bad about that if the public said something about him. Not anymore, See, no desire to do better, Couple of interesting things. This is off a little bit, with the violence, with the segregation and the racism, which I didn't know anything about until my family moved to Inglewood, that part of Chicago. And I also met some white people, or rather Caucasian people, that didn't behave the way that were like really human beings. They were like angels. They like the things that like they put their hand out to help you to do things. I mean, the first job I had in a music store, a German couple, and there was a guy on our block named Charlie. He used to do everything for children, regardless of where they came from or their religions. It was just like, it was always these counter positive forces to keep you from having a completely negative opinion about Caucasian people in your life, And I have to go back to the word Caucasian because first of all, we didn't even use the word white until we moved to Inglewood. That word never even came up. Never even heard of it, And the first, I forgot what class I had. It was some kind of class and they were breaking the races down, Mongoloids and Caucasians and different like that. And I said, oh, so that's who those so-called white people are. They're Caucasians. I said, so when did they become white? That was the other question. I thought before they were German Caucasians and Italian Caucasians and Greek Caucasians. Then all of a sudden they were white. Say, what happened to And even to this day, you never even hear the term Caucasian anymore. So what happened to the Caucasian race? Did it just disappear like the dinosaur or what? You know?
That's great. So this question of practice, I don't know if either of you want to offer some thoughts on this, but this question of practice not making perfect, but practice
Right.
making permanent, right? This was an interesting distinction. Obviously, you're not saying don't study, don't be disciplined, because there's a lot of discipline, obviously, in your work. And so, yeah.
Yeah, that was some kind of theory that had already been passed around. Practice makes perfect. And it's not true. Because if you practice something wrong, you're just putting something in place and something bad in place in a permanent way. Now you're going to have to undo it down the road, you know. And practice is like it's such a individual thing, and it changes in people's lives over the years because you don't have the same time. Your time is not always the same. But I remember a story about Louis Armstrong. I don't know how true it was, but it was always the story that circulated that he practiced every day for so many minutes wherever he was in the world. He would pull out his horn at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, whatever it was, and play for so long every day. You know, I said that made sense too, because you do have to set up these regimented habits. You know, it's just like like dancers have to go to the studio almost every day or every other day, right? A writer has to sit down and knock out so many words. You can't get around that. You know? So all of these disciplines have these practice requirements. You know.
I mean, the way I would put it is that Henry's pointing out the distance between, and he's differentiating the technical aspect of proficiency on your instrument, which does demand practice. You have to be at a certain level of virtuosity to be performing as a professional. And so on the one hand, that technical expertise, and the question of creative expression, artistic expression on the other. That's why it's dangerous to make it permanent. If you think of practice as just learning by heart and imbibing the models of those who went before you, as though the goal of any saxophonist is to play like Charlie Parker, then you're starting to not just have a very narrow view of what art is, but to lock yourself into just the replication of the past. And so that nice phrase, Henry just pulls those two things apart and say, yeah, you have to know how to play, obviously, but that's not the purpose of practice. There's a great moment toward the end where Henry says, I've heard you say it a few times, Henry, that you prefer, rather than the word rehearsal, you like the German word for rehearsal, which is probe. It's the cognate of the English word, but probe, like a searching. Like rehearsal is not you repeat it until you've memorized it perfectly and repeat it, that it's somehow deep down locked into your body. But rehearsal, you repeat something because it's exploratory, because you're opening something up, because you might discover something new. So I think Henry's commitment as an artist is to that understanding of practice and rehearsal as an opening up and an experimental space, rather than perfectionist, learn it by heart so you can replicate it exactly understanding of rehearsal and practice. Am I summarizing that right, Henry? The probe is, I remember the word that you like. Mm-hmm. I do think, can I say one other thing, that I do think that there's a relationship between, going back to the failure is everything question where you began. I'm glad we did not call the book Failure is Everything. Our agent, Chris Calhoun, said, oh, please don't call the book Failure is Everything. Because it can be easily misunderstood. But it is also a political point. And to me, although Henry doesn't talk about it in the book, we don't go quite in that direction explicitly, although I do think it's implicit in the Vietnam chapters, especially where it really is about politics. There's a relationship between what Henry is saying about failure, about the necessity of impediment, having something get in your way and having to push past it, and what a historian or political theorist like Robin D.G. Kelley says about freedom dreams, that if we measure revolutionary potential, the idea of changing the world on the basis of empirical success, then we have actually a blinkered understanding of what revolutionary sensibility means. You have to think about not some kind of I can measure the way the world changed definition of success, but to think about the quality of aspiration, to think about the quality of futurity, of imagining otherwise, that doesn't reduce to teleology, that doesn't reduce to an endpoint that you know where it is and it's fixed and you're just trying to get there. So Henry we don't, in the book, it's not phrased in those terms, but I think that the way Henry talks about failure and discipline and practice, it actually has real deep political resonance. It really is about revolutionary sensibility and what it means to imagine things differently, what it means to imagine a better tomorrow.
Yeah, and I know we're running a little short on time, but there's a couple of points I'd love to just kind of follow along with what you just said there, Brent. There's two things that are really fascinating within this book. One is this drive you've had, Henry, to move past diatonic harmony and not being studied in the music. Maybe you could explain a little bit of what that is and how you've moved to, a different kind of, method in recent years, and maybe just talk a little bit about that breakthrough. And I guess related to that too, I'm really interested in the band or the ensemble as this space for, in one point it's called the crucial space for collective experimentation, or that was actually related to rehearsal. But there's also these discussions throughout the book of bands or ensembles as these kind of radical experiments as well. And so those are two aspects in the book where, again, to what Brent was just saying, it's not necessarily explicitly connected to revolutionary politics, but there is this, you are dealing with kind of how to radically organize in a musical sense and how to kind of think about a revolution or a whole change in what you're doing musically outside of what would be kind of the Western standard, I guess, in some ways. And so those were things that were really interesting for me reading within the book to think about. I know there's not like a direct question there, but just any reflections on either of those. Yeah.
Well, the first part about the major minor system, I just had all I could get out of that system. And so the next place to go was into a chromatic world. And that's a lot of different worlds. It's not just one, it's a number of ones. They're made up worlds, Some are made up and some really exist if you can find them. And I was just fortunate enough to keep slugging away till I found my way into where I am now, into this system that has endless possibilities, And even once you think you know everything about it, I've discovered I don't know everything. There's still some parts of it. There's some new aspects now that I've just discovered, it would take a lifetime, to explore all of the possibilities musically, what I could do with the system, And so, I'm the only one fishing in these waters. So there's no other people to come up and show you what they got. And I'm not really looking for people to do what I'm doing, A lot of the schools and places, they're always like making copies of themselves, the professors make copies of themselves. That's really the wrong approach. The person really needs to find out who they are. They can learn something from me, but they really need to find out on their own who they are, because you ultimately got to come up with a language that you speak, in whatever discipline you might be involved in, And your work is judged. You say, is this consistent with the language of so and so? Does this make sense in terms of like the brush strokes that Van Gogh made? Is that consistent with those strokes? These kind of ideas,
Yeah. When you're putting a band together or you're putting an ensemble together, like one of the things, I think it was in the Library of Congress interview you did a few years ago, you talked about how like not only do you have to think about what people can do, but you have to think about their limitations. You have to think about what they can't do as well. And so maybe you could just talk a little bit about that process for you of putting together a group?
Yeah. Well, when I'm putting together a group, the first thing is I'm trying to discover what is it that I'm hearing? What instruments am I hearing? You know, it's like you're trying to figure out what's in that bread that you just had. Was that, how was it? Cardamom, ginger, cinnamon, and what else was in this? You know what I'm saying? You're trying to figure out what was the makeup. That's the first thing, you know. After that, the whole idea of the first thing you discover is what people, you know, people's comfort zone, what people can do really well. Everybody's got that, you know. I like potato chips, you like popcorn. You know, it's like that, you know. So you see that this person can run really fast, you know. So, oh wow, look how fast he can, look how high he can play those notes. He can just play up to this, he can play up there with Jack and the Beanstalk, you know, the notes are so high. Well, then that's not important anymore because that's known. I'm more concerned about the unknown. So now it becomes, how do I tap into what this person, what they can't do or what they have a hard time doing? So how can I advance? How can I get them to advance, you know, smoothly without any kind of struggle or any kind of resistance? Because you sometimes you have to trick the musicians. Like the same way you have to trick your children into eating some broccoli or something, mix it in with something else. You know. So you just, so it's the same methods, you know. So yeah, that becomes the new idea. How far can I go now? I know from the beginning what I can do because I can see you can jump over the moon, Brent can jump over the fence, but Brent can't seem to crawl under the fence. So now I need to figure out how to get him to do that, you know, because Duke was concerned with that also. He said it's not so much what people can do, it's what it is that they can't do. How do I get into that? See, that's the unknown. That's becomes the most interesting thing because now the palette opens up. The musical palette really opens up, you know.
Yeah, appreciate that.
I'll add one thing. To me, Henry is, first of all, as he explained, thinking as a composer and thinking about a set of ingredients and possibilities and a kind of instrumental palette and what he needs, what he's hearing in his head compositionally, what tools he needs to realize that musical vision. But then as soon as you form an ensemble, it's inherently and unavoidably, and this is part of the beauty and the power of it, a social grouping. It's inherently a grouping of individuals with possibilities and attributes and personalities that you can't predict and you can't entirely control.
Right.
And he's talking about the relationship between those two things. One thing that I would add that I think is profound in Henry's career, you could think of it as a footnote or something that is almost under the surface. But one of Henry's great bands is called the Society Situation Dance Orchestra. And he deliberately, it's a big band, it's amazing and rollicking and party music. He deliberately decided not to record with this group. It's a group that only performs in concerts because the group proposes, Henry's proposing in the name of the group and in the way he uses the group, that something special happens in the cauldron of people in a room together. And one of the things that Henry does, I think, in the book, that one of the arguments he makes is, a lot of people think a musician can be summed up in their discography. And Henry says, my discography, the records I've had a chance, not to dismiss them or to say they're unimportant, but the discography the records that I have had a chance to record are the tip of the iceberg. And they're actually the least important part of my music. What I want to privilege, what I want to foreground, what I want to emphasize is what happens in those social moments, whether it's with Zooid on the bandstand, with a particular group on the bandstand one evening, or with a group like Society Situation Dance Orchestra that doesn't even go into the recording studio. That's only about that social situation. Something special happens there. And actually, that's the main locus of the art. That's really where the art resides, is in those ephemeral comings together of the ensemble. So Henry kind of flips the script, where most people think about how many records did you do? And Henry says, no, it's about all the things that happened that didn't get recorded. And some of the most important things, the most beautiful things, the most moving things don't get recorded, which is obvious when you think about it. And if anybody who cares about music, it's something you can't disagree with when a musician says this to you. But it's also not the way we tend to think about certainly the history of jazz, where we focus on discography and how many records does Henry Threadgill have. Henry really flips that. And when he flips that, he's saying what happens in that social situation with the ensemble and the ensemble's relationship with the audience that night is crucial. That's what I want you to think about. Were you there? What happened to you in the room that evening? And something I love, to me, it's embedded in the name of that band, that idea, that flipping the script, that focus on the social situation, which is a focus on the ensemble and what happens in an ensemble that doesn't reduce to the discographic entry, that doesn't reduce to the recorded output.
Right on. Last thing I'll say quickly, because I know you do have to go. There's a critique throughout the book of capitalism, I feel like, of the relationship of capitalism to music. When you're 24 years old, you write this piece called Where Are Our Critics? Which is partly talking about the lack of Black critics, the lack of Black musician critics at the time. But it's also in it, there's a quote where you say, the US has a commercial, materialistic, capitalistically oriented country, which has, quote, taken on too limited a conception in terms of art, end quote. And so I really appreciated this. There's also a discussion where you talk about art as a formalized realm for radical experimentation, and note that this does not go well with commodification, that these two things don't work well together. And yet also you're a very successful, at least on, in terms of the amazing output and work that you've done over the years working in this realm. And so I'm just interested in your thoughts today, I guess, on music and the music industry and, capitalism, and how you've weathered that personally, through your work and with your, the folks that you've been working with over the years.
Well, I haven't weathered it. I have not weathered it. I'm struggling with it like everybody else. We're still in the same place, marking time, and it's getting to be a little bit more mud that we're sinking down into. Now we have AI, right? We thought the commercialization of the arts were a problem. Well, it's a lot more of a problem now. It keeps coming up. The reason it keeps coming is not AI. I remember a few years back, they did a study here. I don't know the organization. They went around to the high schools and found out that cheating was acceptable. Can you imagine? I mean, no, can you imagine? You don't have to. It is true. So now kids will cheat in high school. That's unheard of in my time. Better to fail. Better to fail. Once you start cheating, so like I went before some college students and I addressed them on this issue because of the cheating that was going on the college level. So I asked these kids, I said, they laughed. They thought I was old-fashioned about the idea of cheating. I say, so if it's all right, that means the girl that's sitting next to you, she's going to be a brain surgeon, and the guy on your left, he's going to fix shoes. But they both cheat. So now later on, are you going to let them fix your shoes, or are you going to let this person operate on you? See, this whole idea of cheating is like, it has gotten all the way down to the grade school level. And so like, we're deep in a type of aesthetic immorality that we've lost our place. We've really lost our place, when children think it's all right to cheat. Where can we go with that? It's a sinking ship. I'll build a boat, and I know the boat is going to sink, but I'm going to sell it to you for the money.
I mean, I would just add one. This is a longer conversation, and not one that we're going to be able to exhaust today. But Henry's experience is extremely interesting in relation to the history of the commodification of Black music, because he's worked with such a range of recording labels, from the big commercial units like Columbia and Arista to mid-level independent to small independent. So Island, About Time, Black Saint, Pi Recordings, his record company now. His trajectory really gives you an interesting and pointed political perspective on the recording industry. And that's one way that to me is one of the stories in the book. It's one of the threads in the book. But commercialization in relation to Black music is complicated. It's not as simple as the goal is anti-commercial or extrication from commercialization. I did an oral history with the drummer Barry Altschul, and he said in the 70s there was a joke around in the downtown scene among experimental musicians downtown in New York in the 1970s, that people would come up to you, a journalist would come up to you and say, "Hey, do you play free music?" And Barry said, "Well, we would say, no, I like to get paid for my performances." And that's also a part of the politics of it, the recognition of labor and the recognition of, I mean, this is in relation to not just the recording industry, but to the nightclub industry, to the ways the music is commercialized across the board, a recognition of the expertise and sweat that goes into the output of the great Black artists in these traditions that we're talking about. So it's not quite that one wants to somehow escape commercialization. One wants to have a just and sustainable relationship with commercialization, but also recognize that a power of the art evades the effort to commercialize it, evades the effort to make it into a commodity. And that to me is that lesson in the society situation moments in Henry's music, that the power of the music is elsewhere. It's not about the LP that you can buy, the CD you can buy. It's about that other thing that happens when an audience and an ensemble come together. But I wouldn't want to say that it's somehow at the bottom of it is an anti-commodity position. The AACM, that's another one of the protocols in the AACM, were extremely savvy about the way their music was circulated and commercialized and made into products, and they made sure that people got paid for their work. So part of the politics of a collective like the AACM is a consciousness about commercialization that doesn't reduce to anti-commercialization, but is a real savvy about labor power and about the economics of music. It's a longer conversation. It's a longer conversation, but that's just to hint at where we'd have to go to talk it through. But I do think it's one of the things Henry really provocatively weaves through the book.
Yeah, right on. And obviously, I mean, as an anti-capitalist, we would make a distinction between, certainly wanting people to be adequately financially supported for their labor and for their work and for what they produce in the world, as, in my view, a little bit distinct from the commodity. But obviously, when you exist in a society, which is a capitalist society like we do, you do have to play by its rules in order to survive and feed yourself, right? And so that's certainly a part of all of that as well. Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much. I know that you do have to run. I really appreciate your time and this conversation and the book. And thank you, Brent and Henry, for this conversation.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.